Good morning. I greet you and welcome you all to this research discussion panel, Waiting for the Job, Covid-19 Impact on the Cultural and Creative Sectors. This event is organized by the European Liberal Forum based in Brussels with the support of Institute Novum, Institute for Strategic and Applicable Research from Slovenia. And today's program was curated and set up by Polygon, the Institute for Development of Creative Industries, also based in Slovenia and the city of Ljubljana. Thank you to the speakers, some joining us from far away, other continents and time zones. Thank you for your willingness to be with us. And thank you also to all those following us via the social networks. Before I start to introduce today's agenda, I will immediately give the floor to Marco Mariani, member of the European Liberal Forum Board of Directors, for the welcome address words. The floor is yours, and many, many thanks for this initiative. Marco.
Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to this webinar titled Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic on the Cultural and the Creative Sector, held with the support of Institute Novum. Thank you all for taking time out and joining us today. My name is Marco Mariani. I'm a member of the board of the European Liberal Forum. For those who do not know us yet, we are a political foundation and think tank of the ALDE party, and we are working across Europe together with the 47 member organizations like Institute Novum. I have to say that Institute Novum is one of the most proactive member associations, and we try to test new ideas for a liberal future in a united new Europe. Today we are going to talk about the cultural and the creative sector and set the basis for liberal discussion on this important topic. The cultural and creative sector are important in their own rights and in terms of the economic footprint and employment. They also spur innovation across the economy, as well as contribute to numerous other channels for positive social impact. I'm really proud to introduce your event today because as Italian, you know that in Italy, everyone likes to describe it himself as an artist. So we strongly believe in that. And in my country, Italy, the cultural creative industry is very important. When I say industry, I mean design and creative industries, cultural industries, the cultural heritage, performing arts, and so on. More than this, today I am very happy to be here because I'm a member of the board of the Orchestra da Camera Fiorentina, which is a very important orchestra. So I know which are the problems in the sector. In Italy, the sector is totally blocked. I'm afraid that it will be more or less the same situation through all the Europe, and it is really a pity for that. But let's think positive. Historically, craftsmen and artisan traditions are very strong, and in my country, Italy, were very strongly developed. After World War II, the economic growth and international contrast introduced new challenges, new modern design for artisanal products, high quality, and also a high quality mass production. So let's hope that the next generation EU plan will be the base for a new renaissance. And I think that the creative and cultural sector will be one of the most important. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I pass the floor back to the moderator. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Marco. Following up on your words, indeed, the importance of the sector has been acknowledged, yet the pandemic has hit it very, very hard. From local community projects to international touring and cooperation, all had to suddenly stand still, close doors, cancel contracts. The sector, as many other sectors, and all of us tried to move online and reinvent itself, as many felt the urge to keep on, but often it happened at our own or at their own costs. The pandemic has shown us on one side how culture is in fact essential to our lives, being indeed our companion in times of lockdown. We turn to our books, music, films, games, stories, food. But on the other side, the cultural sector was one of the most impacted by the crisis, and in addition, in many countries, not benefiting from adequate social status or supporting measures. According to the OECD report that was published in September 2020, cultural and creative sectors along the tourism sector are the most affected by COVID-19 crisis, with jobs at risk ranging from 0.8 to 5.5% of employment across OECD regions. And the study predicts that it will have long-lasting effects and consequences. Most recently, by the end of January this year already, an Ernst & Young study commissioned by the European grouping of societies of authors and composers says that only the aviation industry was hit harder than the cultural and creative sector actually. So it refers to 31.2 loss for the sector in 2020. A 90% loss if we think about the performing arts most specifically, and seems that only video games managed to hold on. The loss for tourism was actually lower, 20%. So culture was the first sector to suspend most of its activities and will probably be the last one to resume as well without restrictions. So how to move on? To start up with, and in order also to develop relevant and adequate support mechanisms and policies for the sector, we need to understand in detail the nature and the specificities of the impacts and where do professionals and also organizations stand now at this point. That is why we are here today. We have an interesting and diversified set of speakers to discuss the questions raised. What are the key challenges of cultural and creative sectors and its professionals in times of COVID-19? And why and what type of support is needed or is more adequate from local to national and international level. We have invited 5 researchers or sector representatives that have been precisely aiming to understand what was going on, have put forward or commissioned or authored themselves analysis of the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on the culture and creative sectors. So we will have insights from what is the scenery in Slovenia, in the African continent, in the UK, but also on behalf of ITM, the International Network for Contemporary Performing Arts, and also UNESCO, that will give us an even wider worldwide perspectives. I will introduce the speakers one by one before I give them the floor. We ask them for very short overviews of their researches or the research they have promoted. From 5, we have given them 5 minutes, and afterwards we will have a discussion to which the audience is invited to participate via the chat. So please feel free to send us your questions and comments. So we will start with Slovenia. Polona Černić. She's an independent researcher and data analyst that has contributed to the longitudinal research Slovenian cultural and creative worker in times of COVID-19. This research is conducted precisely by the curator of today's program, Polygon, the Institute for Creative Industries. So please, Polona, please tell us about your main findings so far. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the word. I will have a brief presentation of our survey of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on workers in the culture and creative sector in Slovenia. The research wouldn't be possible without the support of the Slovenian Center of Creativity. So once again, we thank them for the support. The research was conducted in spring and also in autumn, but the autumn results also confirm spring prediction. So the results was almost similar. The survey target all workers regardless of their legal status, so also students, contract worker, the self-employed in culture, entrepreneurs, and different types of public servants. Slovenian artists had led modest lives even before the crisis, mostly living hand to mouth. Many people would find themselves in a difficult financial situation. But in 2020, their situation due to the epidemic and the state measures around the epidemic has deteriorated drastically. The workers estimates that businesses in the culture and creative sectors in 2020 declined nearly 40% compared to 2019. The most effective field area, as it was already mentioned, was culture and creative tourism, film and audio. Also performance arts, photography, and fashion and textile design. Almost 3/4 of all workers have already received cancellation since the beginning of the pandemic. And also 2/3 of the workers have seen their incomes drop considerably this year. Also 70% of the household incomes have also dropped considerably. So we have a drop in personal incomes and also a drop in the household incomes. The most precarious workers are also the least paid. So their income have gone down the most as a result of the pandemic. And it also has to be mentioned that there is a growing gap between the workers in safer public jobs and the precarious self-employed workers that are still in some way much more safer than the precarious workers. Also, 4 out of 10 workers are not entitled in Slovenia, at least to government support, even thought they needed or have received insufficient support. A third of them have already asked their loved ones for a loan to survive their financial hardship. So workers are basically pushed into poverty, trying to make every euro count, finding it difficult to pay rent and essential bills in everyday life. To make a living, even before the pandemic, nearly 1 of the 3 workers have to do other work related to their profession. In half of the cases, their jobs are outside of the cultural and creative sectors. The autumn results also confirm the low dependence of the 2 sectors on public funding defined in spring. So this was one of our main findings, because there was a presumption that culture and creative sector is dependent on public funding, but the studies, both of them, actually show that this is not the case. The conclusion at the end of the spring survey was that the action must be taken before the summer to save the culture and creative sector. The autumn data then showed that the support measures have been insufficient, and combined with the strict rules of organized cultural events, and devastated for numerous fields and workers. And before the winter started, many of the respondents of workers have already found themselves just above the poverty line. So our question now is, where are they now after basically almost 4 months? And in Slovenia, you have to know that we have a pretty strict measures since the second half of the October, and most of the cultural and creative events and businesses are closed or limited to function. So where are they now? How they are living now? And we are planning, also to note that we are planning to have a third part of our research that will be held in May this year. So this is basically for really, really short introduction of our survey. And maybe I will have a chance to talk a little bit more in the future of our debate.
Thank you, Polona. Not surprising figures and facts, but always very hard to hear them. We will move on now to another speaker. We are going to hear more now about the African continent, or at least part of it, from a speaker coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ribio Nzeza Bunketi Bus, Associate Professor of Cultural and Creative Industries Management at the Catholic University of Congo and of Social Media at the University of Kinshasa. He's the author of Covid-19 and Culture in Africa, a comparative analysis of economic impact studies. Ribio, please tell us how is the situation in the African continent. Ribio, are you there? You need to unmute yourself, I guess.
Okay, it's okay now.
Pleasure, yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. About the African continent, the story started in my home country, the DRC. I did a survey that was very successful, so that I decided to look around neighboring countries to see if they experienced the same situation. And I discovered, apart DRC, we have Senegal, Namibia, Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa. They had a quantitative survey that was most interesting for me. But I discovered also in Angola, Cabo Verde, Ghana, and Mozambique qualitative studies, but I didn't use it. What I did was just a comparison of the similar entries between those different surveys. I was also happy to know that the country that I had covered a bit the 4 regional economic communities in Africa: Senegal from the west, DRC from the center, Namibia and South Africa for the south, and Kenya and Uganda for the east. What are the key findings of the study? The financial losses during the second quarter of the year. All those studies, all those surveys were undertaken during the second quarter of 2020, especially during the first lockdown. And the turnover losses ranges from 134,000 USD to 1 billion.49 in South Africa. But the combined turnover of all the 6 countries is about 1.5 billion USD. Performing arts and heritage were the most affected subsectors, while digital media, online gaming, music, and audiovisual content were more resilient. And the vulnerability of the African creative sector is explained by 5 main factors. The first is the predominance of informal sector. It ranges from 35% in South Africa to 80% in Namibia. The second factor is the significant number of freelancers whose resources cannot withstand shocks. The third is the very small size of companies. The fourth is the prevalence of part-time jobs and short-term contracts. We can say that 58% of companies in Kenya hire people with part-time jobs. And the last factor is the high level of human interaction in the process of production, distribution, and consumption of some particular subsectors, such as visual arts. And from that explanation, I have devised a matrix of COVID-19 impact analysis on culture and creative sector in Africa. We have 3 types of impact: the high impact, explained by the 5 factors that I've mentioned above, and the performing arts, visual arts, and heritage fall under the category of high impact. We have the medium impact with recorded music, television, radio, cinema, and the low impact with digital media, online gaming, and other cultural and product and services using digital tools in the value chain. And there is also an interesting interactive map. You can just click on the link below to see that map displayed. And you can click on different countries concerned by the survey in order to have additional details. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Review. We acknowledge that actually outputs are, I can say, quite similar, despite the very different contexts. Let's move now to the north, or to Northern Lands, to the UK, United Kingdom, and we will have John Wright. Is a lecturer, curator and artist, and currently working as a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Cultural Value, University of Leeds. His work with the center is focused precisely on researching the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural sector and also its implications for policymaking in the United Kingdom. John, hope you are there, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us again. So I thought I'd just go a little bit about the background of the project that we're working on, and go into some of our initial findings. So the project itself is a project which is researching the impact of COVID-19 on the culture sector and its implications for policy. So we're three sort of work streams. So we're looking at the impacts on cultural organizations and practitioners. Work stream 2 is analysis, and work stream 3 is looking at policy responses and impacts. So in the work stream 1, my colleagues William Owen, Dave O'Brien, and Mark Taylor have been carrying out a meta-analysis of the labour force survey by the Office of National Statistics. And essentially they looked at the first 6 months of the pandemic, and they found that there was a significant collapse in working hours across the creative industries. So this was right across the subsectors, but with particular focus and particular kind of impact on the visual arts, theatre, film, and music. And as we can see, there was 55,000 in those sectors, and it's about a 30% decline on the previous 5 years. So those were the main sectors that really hit. So using these data, there's actually a 15% of people working in the creative occupations in between January and March were no longer working in the creative occupations in April and June. So this was significantly greater statistically between the same period in the last 5 years. So on average, it's about 10.5% loss in sort of within the sector, but actually it was up to 15 over this time, and ongoing and emerging. So that kind of loss in retention within the sector has actually presented itself in the sector interviews, which is what I'm actually working on with this qualitative data. And so what we found was that that statistical data actually supported the feedback from people's experiences within the sector. So we found that there was a talent drain, particularly within freelance staff working within different institutions across, be it festivals, theatres, creative organisations, museums and galleries, cultural leaders, right across the UK. There has been a talent drain. Also, this is to do very specifically, many people were sort of saying that this kind of freelance work become unviable under the restriction, and actually that many freelancers fell through the gaps in the funding, which comes onto the sort of point that I've got here, which is that although museums and galleries and organisations have been quite thankful, really, for the furlough scheme and also government assistance schemes, actually what has happened is that many freelancers have fallen through the gaps on this because of their working hours and their different sort of makeups of their income. And actually this has led on to a lot of uncertainty within the sector. And actually the future of funding is really, really uncertain at the moment. And it is causing major problems planning for organizations and indeed people's lives. So we also found that programming became an area that people about in the interviews, and there's actually an acceleration of digital born content, obviously because venues are shut, and this has not been kind of even across all of the subsectors. So some subsectors find this really kind of sort of natural. They're working with it all the time, whereas some subsectors have been forced into actually doing this rapidly and upskilling and upskilling their sort of capacity. But actually, some have fallen away and not been able to engage in this kind of content, and also it wouldn't really marry up with the way that they work. So there is a real divide between festivals, for example, and museums and galleries when it comes to using this kind of tech. So that is something that we've really found. And the social impacts as well. And so actually, interestingly, a number of museums and galleries, especially, and actual some festivals as well, have really focused on community engagement and working with the local people in their area. And actually, what we've found is that many are actually stepping into this this sort of space of civil sort of kind of need that a lot of the communities are having, and there's a sort of civil responsibility and a social responsibility. So some festivals are working with food banks, some festivals are working with education, and actually we are actually beginning to see that now with the funding that is becoming available in certain work from certain sort of streams of funding within the UK. That is actually catching up with this kind of civil responsibility, which is really interesting. So I'm actually undertaking this with a colleague, Karen Gray, and we're actually looking at a broad range of sort of case studies that we might develop from this these interviews. So these are sort of the main areas really that we're looking at, and we're actually going to start now looking very specifically at freelancers because they have been hit, and everybody is telling us that they have been hit the most throughout this pandemic so far. So that is it. I've got some just a link here for anybody who's interested in looking at our stuff, and thank you.
Thank you, John. Another latitude, but similar vulnerability and uncertainty. Now we will move to a wider European and international perspective, but focused on the performing arts sector. That is actually one of the most impacted subsectors. So we will have Elena Polivtseva from IETM, the International Network for Contemporary Performing Arts. She is the head of policy and research at IETM, which is a Brussels-based organization. And she has been coordinating several IETM studies, actually on COVID impact in the performing arts. The first already was published in March last year, performing art in times of pandemic. And the most recent publication, The Moment for Change Now, Learning Points for the Sector and Policymakers. Elena will tell us about it. Elena, we are happy to hear from you. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everyone. Just to add to the description of IATM, IATM is a network of 500 performing arts organizations and independent professionals, both from Europe and beyond. And obviously, as a network, we haven't been doing similar studies as the previous speakers did, so we didn't look into numbers, we didn't look into jobs and revenues lost. We were more trying to kind of detect the trends and developments within the sector and even sense the mood the sector has during the pandemic. So in these times, we have done two papers, and one of them was released already in March 2020, in the very beginning of the pandemic, where we really trying to send the spirit to detect the solidarity mechanisms, the immediate solutions, and also the most urgent needs that the sector had. And we tried to put it into some sensible policy recommendations. This study was done on a preliminary survey with our members, and the main takeaways of it were the following. The first one, obvious one, of course, the most detrimental impact was done to the artists, and they were the most fragile players in the sector. And it was clear, even for bigger institutions, that if you want to rescue their performing arts ecosystem, we need to start with supporting artists. It was also surprisingly clear already from the first days of the pandemic that the international aspect of the sector will suffer the most. The fraudulent link with the audiences in the beginning was felt even worse than the economic consequences. And of course, the solidarity, which was in the DNA of our sector since ages, was already visible from the very beginning. There were plenty of different solutions put forward to support each other. And despite the digitalization, the crazy digitalization that embraced the sector, the live components remain to be very vital in the performing arts. So in December 2020, we tried to look into how the crisis impacted the sector so far. Basically, we looked into how did the power dynamics change in the sector, what were the artistic developments that came up and should grow and expand, what were the lessons learned from the digitalization, what is the future for international work, and what could be the interesting policy solutions that were put forward and should be brought into the future. So basically, there were 9 learning points, which I would very briefly share now. The first one is, of course, about the huge, massive gaps that exist in the sector between various players in the ecosystem, between countries in Europe and beyond, and between different players such as publicly funded institutions and independent players and so on. So we all talk about performing arts being hit the hardest, but the situation is more complex than that. And actually now I think we have some momentum for some fair relations and some solidarity to be developed, and also to look how internationally we can actually prevent from inward thinking and to connect local situations to each other globally. The second lessons we learned was that there are a lot of scattered initiatives and attempts to discuss how to basically not to wait the crisis and to learn something from it, but almost every country lacks like a nationwide, perhaps a conversation what could be the seize the momentum and to emerge from the crisis in a better shape. The third learning point was that flexibility is key for creating relevance. Basically, funders in many places practiced a very interesting concept of agile and flexible funding when their beneficiaries could adapt their creative process based on what they thought was the most necessary for the society. And we think that pandemic is not the first and basically not the last extraordinary event that will shake our sector, but also the world. So in this sense, it would be interesting to look how funding could continue being agile and flexible and basically allow every artwork to reinvent itself along the way. Then we also noticed that the sector was pushed to reinvent itself, but the cultural policies obviously were lagging behind. And maybe it's a moment to think how they can also be reshaped based on the knowledge that policymakers gained about the sector, and also using the momentum of the sector actually organizing itself better due to the pandemic. Digital literacy, of course, it's a very important topic for the performing arts. We haven't thought before seriously about copyright issues, online privacy, monetization models, access for audiences with disabilities, and also the digital footprint. Then the sixth learning point, which I personally find the most important one, is that in crisis, we all should learn to accept the crisis, takeaway for the sector is that we need to adapt our mindset and stop thinking, obsessing about quality and success, and instead thinking about relevance. And the takeaway for policymakers, obviously, is that it's unfair to demand the same results and outputs as were demanded from the beneficiaries before the crisis. And we should all remember that adaptation and experimentation doesn't go together with the market logic. So what was also interesting to see is that interests and needs of different players in the sector were very different from each other, and sometimes it created some kind of divides and even conflicts in the sector. So instead of looking into very specific and urgent needs of different players in the sector, maybe it could be interesting to start thinking, what does the society need today? And we believe that that would help also to reassess success, visibility, value, quality, and actually the meaning of what we are doing. Freelancers, of course, we said about it already today, and I think this is clear that in all countries and at the EU level, there should be some concrete action done in order to solve various problems which impacted the lives and professional development of freelancers in this pandemic. And the last learning point we find important is that international has been kind of becoming like a vague, not very clear area. And it was for some like an excitement moment to think about the local, to find inspiration around the corner, to go slow, to go work with communities and so on, which is absolutely crucial. And we think it's a good moment to indeed re-explore the local resources, but not to go to another extreme. We should remember that the arts and also the audiences need international exchange. And that's why maybe it's an interesting moment to connect locality with the global concerns and developments in the world. So those are the 9 learning points which we learned. So as I said, it's not about figures, but as Christina mentioned, this interesting study by Ernst & Young, performing arts lost 90% of its revenues compared to 2019. And this is 37 billion euros. And I think more losses are yet to be estimated. So thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Elena. Well, besides the same negative impacts, as you have focused on the learning points, it's great to hear this forward-looking, positive perspective. Indeed, adaptation, experimentation, we might need to rediscover the relevance of art and artists nowadays. We are moving on to our final speaker, which is coming from Canada, Montreal. Allow me a special thanks to him, since he was so kind and motivated to wake up too early to be here with us today. It is Charles Vallerand. He has offered for UNESCO Culture in Crisis, a policy practical guide for a resilient sector. He is an independent consultant in cultural policies, public service broadcasting, and international cooperation, works with Telefilm Canada, and is also the editor of Cultures in the Digital Era, a weekly press review covering emerging policy issues for arts and culture in Canada and internationally. Please, Charles, we are happy to hear you. You may take
Okay. Yeah, Christina, if you don't mind, I'll try and share my screen so I can show, hopefully I can show the table of contents of the publication. And while I do that, it's going to help me and everyone sort of focus on the content. So yes, thank you for having me. Yes, it's very early, but I thought maybe this is a time. If you don't share knowledge, maybe it's going to be too late. So I think this publication was intended for that. This is the result of, as you've mentioned, the newsletter. I've been covering and tracking what the world has been doing to alleviate and mitigate some of the challenges around the COVID-19. What I did for UNESCO is a database now on the website of UNESCO. So you look up by sector, by country, types of measures. This led to a movement of debates, started with the culture of ministers and vice ministers somewhere in April. 130 and some ministers attended, so everyone could explain what Burkina Faso was doing, what Cabo Verde, and so on and so forth. And now I think there are more than 170 of those resiliarts debates, and this could have been one actually. So very, very strong international solidarity. And when UNESCO saw all the very good material that was being assembled, they said, well, maybe it's not just to explain what's happening, but to give tools. So this publication is actually going a little bit further, not only to present a compilation of what is being done, but actually explain the pros and cons. What are the lessons learned? If you're going to, we're looking at the screen, if it's going to be about social benefits, there are many ways to address this. What are the lessons learned for the countries that have tried such measures, and how could we learn from not repeating the same mistakes? So it's very practical, very short, it's 55 pages long. And I hear now that it's being translated into other languages. So obviously it's picking up steam and it's responding to a need. I also need to mention that this is, first wave COVID measures. We're now in the second wave COVID measures. We're now looking to reopen, relaunch, adapt facilities, see how we can distance and so on. So there's other monies coming in now for measures that were not captured in this publication. I think the intent was to be quick enough that countries that were still pondering and sectors that were still trying to see how to move past the challenges. So the measures, I think, can be grouped in three broad. So this is a compilation. This is really trying to make sense of all that's out there, trying to have a balanced approach. So small, less developed countries, emerging countries, different continents, and so on. There's been really a careful balance of best practices, I guess, in these measures. And it's also to recognize that some of these measures are actually old measures that are just being adapted. There a lot of the cultural policy, I was listening to the previous presentation, a lot of policies actually are working. So governments know they work and they just can quickly tweak them, turn them around, apply them. And what is especially important is for policies to achieve rapidly their goals. If you want to send money, what's the best effective way for the money to get in the hands of artists when they have to pay rent and make a decent living? So you're going to be looking maybe for partners. You're going to be, decentralize the administration. You're going to go to associations that have the reach in the regions, that have the membership, that know artists that are possibly in the informal sector, not all registered with government, not to pay taxes or have to declare revenue. We know that's a sensitive issue. You see the kind of challenges in terms of quickly reacting, but also quickly having effect. And we see other measures that are novel, that are somehow, let's try this, see if it sticks, if it works. And it's also interesting. I think it was also mentioned that digital is certainly one area. I think we were all sort of confronted with the need to rapidly sort of pivot is the word. How do we quickly adapt to audiences shifting? How do we quickly adapt our business model? How do we monetize? And so I think for organizations, for creators, but for policies as well, it's been a challenge. And these are certainly some of the newer approaches. And I would venture to say that I think some of these experiments, let's call them experiments, are gonna stay. I think some of the festivals that have gone online have realized there's an audience online. There's potential for reaching out way more broadly than just a local attendance that they would normally have in the facility itself. There is maybe also a longer presence, not just when the festival is being held, but ensuring that you have the right to possibly show the films, show the performance in longer duration of time. So there's been a lot of that sort of pivoting in policies and organization, and therefore there's been a lot of assistance to individuals to train, to become resilient, be better managers in times of crisis, managing staff, managing communications, training for, again, performing arts, adapting and creating new forms of maybe possibly new forms of artistic expression that are hybrid, that sort of mix. And we've seen operas and we've seen theaters and we've seen all sorts of very interesting mixing also technology, AR and VR in those experiments. So I think some of this is going to stick. And also a very interesting development that I'll go over the table of content. I'm freelancing here. I'm just going as I go. But another very interesting development is we've seen governments for many, many years resisting the temptation to launch something like a platform, like a portal, like something that would be government run. Let's leave it to the private sector. There's Google and there's a lot of, why would the government be involved in this? But now in the COVID time, when everything is sort of locked down, all the inflow of foreign products, all the inflow of quality stuff, streaming, torrent of content, I think the governments realized that if they were not going to step in, there was not going to be much from the local cultural expressions. So both to have artists sort of work was a quick way to get them, So comes to mind. There are many of such platforms and many such commissioning of works. But I think of Cabo Verde in Africa again, which said, 100 artists. I can't remember the amounts of dollars or euros they were paid, and quickly go online and make this, entertainment and create new works, which is also very interesting. Realizing that this is maybe an opportunity to inspire. Same in Cuba, same in Mexico, same in Argentina. There's been many of those platforms. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what's the discoverability of these, artists. Are these government experiments reaching out to audiences? Is the connection strong? Is the government, having invested in such platform, going to continue playing a role? But it all brings up all these questions that for a long, long while at UNESCO, there were some countries pushing, we have to pivot to digital. It's coming, and many countries were resisting, saying, no, there's so much to deal with, social of the status of the artist. We have to deal with copyright. We have to deal with infrastructure, all the old, but now suddenly it's like, oh, it's here. So I don't want to take too much time, but some of these, so we've grouped these measures into three broad categories. I guess one is the direct support to artists and professionals. And no surprise, adapting social benefits measures, trying to commission and purchase works. So we've seen the Arab United Emirates having to cancel their contemporary fair of visual arts, and then suddenly saying, well, we have the money, so let's commission and acquire works that we can sort of put in our embassies. So that's one very concrete example. Compensation of loss of income, there's been a lot of that. And I find interesting, one of the example that comes to mind is a country, I believe it's Bulgaria, where, coming out from the sort of old socialist communist era, you have a lot of employment in the sector that is still government run. So they said, okay, we'll ensure obviously salary, but also we'll ensure salary for those that are now moved to the private sector and nonprofit. Skills development, I've touched on that, very, very important, and a way to keep people busy, keep them development, researching and developing, and possibly compensate for the fact that they're being training. Singapore comes to mind. They have a very good scheme. Ireland, Australia have very good schemes for managers and also for creators and artists. And then also something which is very simple is to accelerate payments. Sort of say, oh, we're going to, in any case, we have the budget. In any case, we're going to fund, creating films. We're going to fund commissioning works. We're going to fund this. Why wait 6 months? Why wait for, there's normally there's a protocol. You have to deliver and then you're paid. So the advance payments, and it's interesting that some of these copyright collective society have also said, based on historical access, we'll pay you upfront what normally will be coming in the coming months. Temporary relief of regulatory obligation in the broadcasting sector, media sector. Normally you have obligations to air national content, so maybe make that lighter, or you have to pay a fee because you have a license, may also alleviate those costs. Interruption losses, taxes and social obligations, very strong in Europe. Stimulating demand. We've seen that in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, taxes, VAT taxes, and we've seen that in the UK as well. Lower those taxes, remove those taxes, make them, at par in the real world, in the digital world, again, to stimulate. And this is, again, measures that are going to be with us coming out of the COVID. And there are calls now to extend those measures, but I think some of the changes are going to be, with us for going forward. Loans, these are businesses, obviously, and loan guarantees, preferential rates, way to accommodate, and again, working with the banking sector, working with the financial institution for government not to do everything, but to steer and to have policies that really stimulate. Infrastructure and facilities, that's a pretty good one. Again, governments have this responsibility to keep it up. I think of Mexico here, where Mexico was going in any case, but they said, okay, let's start this now. And in adapting facility, adapt for digital, adapt for distance performance, adapt so you have the same infrastructure quality to provide the same high level performance that will compete with what's coming out from international content. So that's been key. And we see the digital transition of infrastructure as well, assisting smaller organization transition, digitize their collection, digitize their capacity to manage, digitize access. So that's been really one. I think of Japan. Japan has a very good program. And then lastly, which is also a similar approach, I'm going down, sorry, I'm doing this very quickly, it's the 5-minute thing. And then we'll go to questions. Oh, I have issues. So it's the notion of assisting the sector adapt and remain competitive. I think some countries are already saying, and we see this in New Zealand, we see this in Australia, we're starting to see this in Korea, we're starting to see in the Nordic countries. It starts to think ahead, So Australia, for instance, is already thinking about launching a big international promotion, a strategy to attract investment, to attract people to travel, to attract people to come and see culture, because we're all going to be eager to see culture when we come out of this. So how do we prepare? Needs assessment, very, very important. I think a lot of what was said today is about reaching out to the right source, get to artists, get on the ground. And a lot of countries have used this as an argument not to act too quickly. I think of Brazil, the president of Brazil was saying it's not serious, there's no COVID. And for many months, they were delaying and consulting. People were dying and the sector was closing and people were moving to other lives than being artists. So I think it's not an excuse, but it's certainly one way to make sure that we do it right. Adapting business model, promoting national content, I've touched on that, and attracting foreign investment. That's also coming, certainly in the audiovisual sector. It's very interesting to see that many countries are investing for film, for television production, are trying to keep it going. It's obviously strategic for them. It's a very highly competitive business. A lot of countries are competing to attract, Hollywood, mega tentpole productions. So obviously this is one that has benefited from policies and measures. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for this panoramic. You have opened up also some doors for hope, and we will have some time now to come back to some of the issues raised. Thank you to all the speakers for your valuable work and also for your short but very meaningful interventions. It was a pleasure to hear you. In case there are any questions from the audience, please do not hesitate. The moment is now, so it would be good to have some interaction. Any moment, please write us your messages on the chat, and we will give also priority to these questions. In the middle of all this crisis and negative figures and facts, we have also heard you referring to solidarity, to creativity, because artists actually remain creative. And actually, we tend to say that crisis is a source of creativity. And I would ask you, what were the most surprising or unexpected findings you came across? Anything that have struck you from the negative or from the positive side? Were there interesting alternatives or proposals? Charles has referred to some already, to counteract the crisis and build new business models out of the crisis. Was there any unexpected finding? I would start to ask the Polona, John, Ribio. because they concentrated more on their figures and then findings on the national and also in the case of Africa, more regional level. Would you want to
yes, I can say a little bit more about our research, because it was mostly quantitative research, but also a qualitative research. So we had quite a few open questions, and respondents actually wrote quite a lot to these questions. And one of the questions was also what are they proposing? How do we can solve this crisis, or go to have next steps to the future? And we then make three final sum ups of those answers. And first was that actually Slovenian culture and creative workers would like or would suggest to implementation of the basic universe income without any additional condition. They will also like to have the introduction of vouchers for culture and creativity, different types, and also some part of temporary tax relief. So they're looking basically from the state part with this kind of measure. What was the surprising from this research was basically that in some part it was research about poverty, because actually the status of the workers in the creative and cultural industries in Slovenia, it wasn't, as I mentioned before, good even before the crisis, and now it will, especially for those freelancers and precarious workers, it isn't good right now, and we are actually afraid of the future. They of course have some help from the state, but it also is a question if they will have to give this help back in the future months. So a lot of questions also with this epidemic. We don't know what will happen in the next few months. Yes.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Polona. Review, John, you want to add something also from your researches?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. So I may have sort of touched on a lot of the quantitative stuff, but the actual part of the project that I'm working on is actually quite qualitative, because we are doing these interviews, looking at this experience of these of individuals within the sector, and they're also part of organisations as well. So what's really quite interesting is that in sort of, especially in Scotland, for example, a lot of the funding has been sort of focused on education, and it has been focused on this kind of like civic responsibility that has begun to come out, and it's also really focused on freelancers compared to individuals compared to what is happening in England, and also that again is quite prominent in Northern Ireland as well. So there's sort of a divide that's beginning to happen between the sort of the funding that Arts Council England, for example, is really focused on organisations, whereas the sort of devolved funding for other nations is actually looking more at this kind of civic responsibility and also on individuals. So that is the kind of divide that has begun to begin to be shown really in the kind of the interviews, and also this real kind of sense that yes, there's been sort of tax breaks for individuals as well, and kind of for sort of for freelancers, but actually there's a distrust. A lot of the artists distrust the government with these sort of loans, etc. And actually, this distrust is sort of manifested in a lot of artists not being able to like, engage with actually applying for this funding, and there's a lot of confusion around that as well that we're seeing, and this is quite this is something that's really come to the fore through this process. So there's a lot of confusion around, which I think is kind of manifesting in even more unease than was necessary. So it is something for policy as well as this that's coming out, which we think we're going to feed into that side of the project, which is this need for sort of a more uniform approach, more in a way that kind of looks at all the kind of nuances and the differences within each part of the sectors and subsectors, and that's what is needed really at the moment, because there's sort of from this top-down approach, there's a kind of a slight misunderstanding about certain parts of how the sector works in government, and that is what's sort of coming out from a lot of the experience that we're looking at with the interviews really. So it's kind of and what is really sort of unsurprising but also slightly surprising is the actual difference across the whole country, in the sense of each subsector is dealing with it in a completely different way. So there's a lot of networking that's developed. So a lot of the festivals, for example, in Scotland, didn't used to necessarily sort of work with each other a lot. They're in sort of competing with each other a lot. But actually, these networks and skill sharing and kind of just support groups, informal support groups, have actually developed, which are really interesting, like across the UK. And so there's a bit of hope there for future sort of sharing of knowledge. It may not be as siloed as it has been before. So that is one sort of really positive thing that's coming out of everything, really. So yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Thank you, John. Review, you want to add?
Yes. For me, the study was not really, or the results of the study were not too surprising, because they reflect a little bit the situation, the social and economic situation of the continent we already know. But I think that the relevance of the result is to show people that the creative sector, we often ignore it. All the major stakeholders, government, artists, private bodies, they don't pay too much attention to enable the sector to be really a driver of social economic change on the continent. And now the study shows us the shortcomings of the sector, and it is time to take action. It's time to take action, and now they are more aware that culture is very important. And I'm very also happy that the African Union theme of this year is arts, culture, and heritage. So I think that is an opportunity for the world continent to take advantage of our cultural heritage, of our cultural diversity.
Thank you, Review. Elena, you talked about solidarity. Will you have some examples to share with us, or any other positive and unexpected reactions or results coming out of the crisis, actually, in the sector?
For us, solidarity examples were not the most surprising. We're actually the least surprising findings that came out of our study. And there are many, many in our study. Maybe we could just share the link, like food banks or special funds to help professionals to pay rent, sharing spaces, sharing houses even. So it goes on and on. There are plenty of them. But what was personally for me very interesting, maybe not that much surprising, but interesting to see in our study, were two things. One is how the artistic form has been crazily reinventing itself during the pandemic times, and how this influenced the power dynamics within the value chain. I will give you an example. For example, a theater piece, which was meant to be a classical theater piece with actors on stage and audiences in the room, became a social media project, just like in 2 weeks. And then it was combined with a YouTube channel and also activism, basically some actions on the street, with a bit of visual art and also some street art, performing arts. So basically everything which was absolutely possible in the pandemic times, but this all together, it all became one artistic project. There were like no new social media accounts created for basically heroes and characters of this performance. And the people who were behind this project, they said, we don't want to go back on stage anymore, and we actually not even interested in watching stuff on stage anymore. And obviously, of course, it's not that every single theater piece turned into a social media project or anything like that, but these things are happening a lot. And there are many other examples how art was happening beyond digital, like artistic companies sending letters to their audiences with cards and with riddles and with stories, whatever. Like it's all goes like beyond our imagination what artists have been doing these days. And this obviously makes them less dependent on venues, on institutions, on even digital platforms such as YouTube or anything like that. So, and venues at the same time, many of them, like especially bigger ones, realized that they are dependent on this creativity, which was happening outside their doors. And they needed to reach out and to reshuffle their financial resources and to think how they actually go on. So this was like a crazy rethinking of everything. Like, of course, there are a lot of venues which just closed their doors until 2022, and they said that like we see you in new life, and I think we can understand them as well. But these interesting dynamics happening, I think they will really leave like huge imprint on our sector, how interactions will continue. And actually it's quite positive because I think artists and companies deserve a bit of more freedom and also a bit of more recognition. And I do hope that bigger institutions will also use it as a positive dynamic, as a positive development. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's really very interesting to hear you all. And you said, Elena, just now that solidarity was not a surprise. Indeed, you are right, but more collective organization, yes. And I think this is one of the good consequences coming out of the crisis. I have witnessed, or I witnessed the same in my country, Portugal. That indeed many support groups being formed, people coming together to try precisely to understand what is going on, but also trying to advocate and to speak at one voice. And this has been always a kind of a shortcoming of the sector, the difficulty in coming together in one voice or in many voices, but all together. And I see some hope and some prospects for a better collective organization of the sector. And this, in my view, is a very good outcome. You have also referred to the digital, and I think this is an important issue that I will address Charles, also because he's an expert on the audiovisual field. We have seen from several of the researches that indeed music and audiovisual, gaming, digital media, of course, naturally were the most resilient, and some of them didn't have big losses, let's say. But still, at the same time, film, even music, the music industries seem to not be totally prepared for this crisis. Well, nobody was prepared, but the digital, the fact that they have been digital already for long and had the skills seem not to be a total solution. So what is actually needed? We've been talking about skills. There's also the problems in monetization of activities. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, Charles?
Sure. Do you mind if I did not answer your question before on what's the good news or solidarity? Do you mind if I
Oh, please. Oh, please.
thoughts on that?
Please,
and then we can move to the digital, because one of the one of the things I did not have to mention in my presentation is that these policies and measures are not one size fits all. You know, and that's the, you know, where we look to Germany, we look to the UK, we look to Canada, we look to some of the developed country, but you have to also consider the local history and the local conditions. And I was really struck, and I think that's very important and very good news for us all, to find examples of very sort of practical way to assist artists in the very real world that they're in. It comes to mind Peru or Bolivia, but I think it's Peru, in Lima, where street artists, people are entertaining at a corner of a street in the subway. and possibly live on the street or are in very poor condition, were brought meals, were brought clothes, were brought, ways to keep going. In Ecuador, a lot of the cultural, both artists and their managers are in the informal sector. They're not registered anywhere. So to reach out to these artists, the government determined that if they know how many hydro energy you consume in a house, and below a certain level of hydro consumption, you're considered poor. You're considered, you don't have appliances, you don't have, internet. And they would qualify the needy for social assistance, and they captured artists and their managers as part of that group. They said, we're going to reach out by, you see how practical and how adapted to the national context this can be. So I think that's one very interesting lesson, human lesson that we could all learn here, not to think big, but sometimes to think small. And human, be kind to one another. I think the other lesson that I think, or trend I've heard from Elena, but I think another trend is that we're all becoming national, way more national than we've ever been, or regional or continental. Define it the way you want it. But I've been struck how this COVID business has been all about, finding one solution. We don't share, even on vaccines, it's only come very lately, and even on, research, and certainly in the arts sector, who wants to tour? Who wants to consider going out? We all know it's not going to be the normal that we used to know. We're not going to travel as much. We're not going to be welcome as much. And so there's been this need to program. Obviously, the same festivals are now looking for acts that are going to be coming from the country, and discovering artists and reaching out to artists to create works that will feed into the cultural centers and the programming that normally would have come from international artists, which is going to be a threat, obviously, to mobility, and it's going to be a threat to the, for many in the circus world and puppet world, and it's going to be very challenging because that's where the business was. But it's very interesting, for maybe local artists, that there is this new trend of rediscovering, possibly. So it's just some of the good news, I think. Some of the threats, but some of the good news. On the digital, I think we've covered pretty much every, it's the skill thing, it's the technology. I like to think that we have to, even though it's not for us to do and it's not in our scope, access to internet and the digital divide is first. What comes to mind. There cannot be distance education, that cannot be e-commerce, that cannot be citizen participation when 40-50% of the country still is on low access internet, when they don't know how to operate, when you're older, when you're not prepared for this, you don't know how to find things. You can find things because everyone says Netflix, and you go on Netflix and you go on Google, but you don't know how to find your local artist. You don't know how to find what's coming up next week at your local theater. That's a problem. So I think governments have started, in my country at least, stepping in to make sure the last mile, the last house, the last village is connected to this and is reaching out to the world. Otherwise, it's a disadvantage. How can you compete when everything's coming from China and you can't, be on the internet, have a good site, and be sure you're discovered? So I think that's one we tend to neglect. It's not in our scope. We sort of say, oh, that's telecoms or communications, but actually that's fundamental. And the other thing is, which is a very big thing in this country, certainly, and it's now becoming a bigger thing in others, is what we call discoverability, how to be discovered. It's not enough to create. We tend to put a lot of effort, and governments put a lot of effort on the artists. It's been traditionally so. We make sure they have money to create, to experiment. We create a facility when they can perform. And now suddenly everything's becoming virtual, but we don't know how to reach audiences. We don't know how to build audiences. We don't know how to create repeat business. Maybe we were lucky that they find us and suddenly we have a big event, a big success. But are they going to come next week? Are they going to be faithful? Are they going to subscribe to the season? How can we make money out of the subscribe to the season business? That's a whole different ball game. And then you have to go and work with the algorithms. You have to work with the midday data. You have to work with the way that people have queries. And queries are not about, it's about what's playing this week in my village? And you have to have an answer to that. And you need to equip the artists and the performing groups, and to be able to prepare the data, not only for the websites, but for the mobile platform, which is also a challenge in itself. We're now all on cell phone. So you see the kind of collective intelligence, know-how that we need that bridges. It's a long answer, but I think it's an important one, so we understand the challenge ahead of us, period.
Thank you, Charles. Anybody else wants to add something on the digital issues? Or then Charles also refer to the challenges of international mobility nowadays and after the pandemic. This has hit very hard, especially the live arts. Any expectations, fears, new proposals coming from the sector? No, Elena or Ribio. John, please feel free to add.
I can add on mobility if you want. As I said, like there is like a crazy rethinking going on in the sector, how to do things differently, and not because of COVID only, because before already, like there was like this mounting frustration with mobility becoming too hectic, too scattered, too ad hoc, and too exhausting for everyone. I think everyone now could practice zero mobility and to assess what this means for us. And actually, it's not just a few months. We really are given quite a lot of time to experience what it means not to tour at all. With ITM, we have just launched actually quite a large-scale initiative, a project funded by the European Commission, which is called Perform Europe, in which we're going to think how touring can be done in a sustainable and inclusive way. And here it goes all about, not just about green mobility, just so that it's clear, it talks about how to create it in a basically meaningful way in all senses: artistic, human, economic, ecological, and social. How to connect the dots which are currently being disconnected. There are plenty of already interesting examples how to do things. And I already mentioned one when I was talking about flexible funding. Like flexibility means relevance. It's not only about funding, but it's also about what we create. Basically working in a scalable way. I don't know if I'm using this word in the correct way, but to create something that can be used in different venues, in different settings, for different audiences, for various environments, in different media. So this is what COVID really taught us to do, to create something keeping in mind various scenarios. But not like, I think in the future, we shouldn't only think about it like in terms of survival solution or in terms of emergency scenarios, but more like in the sense how to make most use of our work, how to make it the most possible relevant for as many people as possible. And this also relates to touring. When you tour, we talk about it everywhere a lot. It's better to be shown to as many venues and audiences as possible. So you come to a capital, go to suburbs, you go to rural areas and so on, considering that your piece might just be transformed along the way when you come to different venue. So I think this scalable work and flexible funding, this is something that could be looked at as a way to make things more sustainable and more relevant, not only for the sector, but also for societies.
Thank you. Indeed, well, the pandemic is bringing the opportunities somehow finally to act on some concerns and issues that actually were there already, concerning mobility and ethic over mobility that we're all engaged with, the environmental issues, social imbalances as well, digitization. This seems to be really an opportunity for change. If there is, yes, review. That's what I was trying to take a look at you. Please review.
Okay, thank you. I think that international mobility is an important issue because many artists, especially in subsector like visual art, painting, photography, they depend mainly on exchange, cultural exchange with the North and the South. So with bans on public gatherings and restrictions on travels, it's very difficult for them to prepare and to work correctly. So they are losing a huge proportion of their revenues. So it's very tough for them. And about the digital environment, I think it's an opportunity for Africans because we see that with online content it's possible to generate revenue to continue producing, but the local infrastructure for access to internet of quality is also a problem. But hopefully some countries are making it. If you see the global reports of We Are Social and Outshoot for the last year regarding the growth of internet penetration in Africa, it's up to 10% in Africa, and Nigeria also is making it. That is why Netflix has decided to open a special catalog in Nigeria. But it's also an issue for other countries in Africa. So the infrastructure is very important for making internet available to the wider audience, to the consumers, but also upskilling the cultural entrepreneurs, the creative workers, to know how to deal with that new environment, which is not easy. I think digital literacy and other management advices in order to enable them to be very successful in the digital environment.
Thank you. Well, time flies, even faster on the digital space. You have been saying, or some of the researchers pointed out, that support measures are not sufficient or are not adequately being distributed. How are your research findings being used? Have they found their way to relevant stakeholders? Any outcomes? Are there policy consequences or recommendations out of your research? Any advice you would send out, whether to policymakers, sector representatives, or even to cultural organizations? I would like to lastly actually hear you on, we have around, 8 minutes more or less. I would like to hear you on that.
Well, maybe I can start.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief on this one. I'm going to just say that a lot of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing have to do with the big internet companies. You know, they have the financial capacity, they own the software, you know, the algorithms is there to control, it's private. We don't access it. So we see a lot of countries trying to learn from one another and try to be strong from the strength of other countries. If you follow the news cycle, you know that Australia right now is struggling and trying to impose obligations on Google, especially to pay for news. Well, what's going to happen in Australia, and it's a battle, and what's happened in France because an agreement was signed, is going to inspire what's going to happen next in the EU and what Canada is going to be doing. So I think we all have to share, and we have to be strong, and we have to be able to be practical, because it's fine to say, here's your obligation, but if they don't agree, they're going to take us to court. They'll take us to court for years, and with resources we can't not afford. So we have to find a way that works. But this is one common challenge and one common opportunity.
Yeah, very, very true. Somebody else wants to add on? John?
Yeah, so our project will be, we've basically assembled a policy advisory group, and there'll be so there'll be government stakeholders with that, so DCMS, etc., Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So this will, you know, the outcomes of the project will be going, you know, directly to the government. But on the kind of notes that have been touched on, there's a lot of sort of tension throughout the UK, for many different reasons, and I think this idea of kind of like sharing and learning, that in a really practical sense, is going to be really important, that Charles sort of brought up, because it is what is beginning to happen on a really local level within sort of like microcultures kind of thing, and there's things like sort of digital residencies that are beginning to happen within visual arts. So where it's not about putting on the exhibition, for example, It's actually about creating content sort of together in a you know, a workable space. But again, it kind of comes to this question of like a sort of ownership of that as well, and the kind of infrastructure that is there for that. And it is the tech companies again, where all this stuff is kind of made on in a sense, or accessed with it. So so what happens to this stuff that's been developed and this really interesting work? So for example, one of the people that I'm talking to based in Manchester, and they're sort of doing a residency with somebody in Sao Paulo. So there's this massive kind of push to kind of open up in that sense, and to work across continents, but actually in the end, to actually feasibly do this in a kind of sustainable way is going to be the real sort of push as well. And touching on that kind of idea of access as well, in areas of Scotland, for example, there's real problems with infrastructure, digital infrastructure as well, and actually there's some real need for this to be a kind of a moment where we really do change this, and money is put in, and actual, you know, and also in that level of sort of research and development money as well for digital within culture. There's not enough emphasis on that at the moment in the UK in general, and I think that is going to be one of the main things. So yeah, hopefully that touches on things that have been said.
Thank you, John. Polona, review?
Yes. Our study was most directly used in one of our municipalities, the second largest municipality in Slovenia, Maribor. After they saw the findings of the research, they found a special stipendiums for artists and
policy or ways ahead. I can see you now.
I can go. Yes, for the study I did, there is no special outcome right now. I don't know, maybe in the coming months or in the coming years. But the main policy recommendation is for African governments to see culture as an opportunity. We cannot rely only on mineral resources, natural resources. And for investing in the cultural sector, they need to map the sector to commission studies, surveys, in order to better understand the dynamics, the internal dynamics of the sector, so that all the policies they are going to devise, all the action plan they are going to implement will lay on the better knowledge of the situation. And in the continental level, we advise the EU to work in partnership with the Afro-Exim Bank, which is the African Export-Import Bank, who has granted $500 million USD to the creative sector in Africa. This is something which is unprecedented. I think they should work closely so that that money can be used in order to support to support currently the cultural workers, but also to build a sound infrastructure that will be the basis for the development of the creative sector in Africa.
Thank you, Ribio. Elena, if you have a final word, you have referred to the Perform Europe program. Is there any other expectation or recommendation at EU level? That
like a lot of recommendations at EU level. I think it's like I cannot. Of course, the one like, and now this one is becoming quite tangible. There is an idea of European framework for working conditions in culture and creative sectors and industries. I use the word which is in the European Parliament resolution about culture recovery of Europe. So this one, if it goes through, I think it could be a revolutionary, historic achievement of COVID times, even if I know that working conditions were on the agenda of the EU already before the pandemic. But I think this is something that we really need to follow up and to support and continue pushing forward. And there are like currently a lot of recommendations running in the air, and Culture Action Europe are doing a big campaign about resilience plans of national member states. So I will not go on that. I would just maybe want to say that what could be interesting for researchers to look at if it's not being done yet. I think in this kind of panel, we voiced a bit different points of view. I don't know how obviously they were different, but I thought there was some kind of opinion that policymakers are not reacting sufficiently, and they are not, I use this word lagging behind. I didn't mean that they're not reacting, but I wanted to say that the cultural sector has been reinventing itself in a much faster pace than cultural policies. And on the other hand, we also looked at all the good measures that were taken. I think it would be interesting at the next research step to analyze how did actually funding structures change post-COVID? I mean, we're not yet post-COVID, but this year already a lot of new funding programs being out. And it's very interesting to see that some of them are still based on the previous guidelines, the previous values, and some others are better rethought. So I think it would be interesting this year to look into how the funding instruments have shifted and evolved, and to assess how cultural policies were actually adapting to the COVID times.
Thank you, Elena. Well, a lot of valuable information and food for thought. We have to round up and close. It is clear that it is essential to keep on investing on research, so to provide evidence and facts and arguments to better advocate and defend the sector, but also to better inform the policy making and to better act. So it's crucial that cultural institutions, operators realize the relevance of research and engage and open up the doors to universities, to research centers, so to promote the development of knowledge about the sector. This is really the first step for informed advocacy and acting. It is not surprising, on my view at least, that there are many similarities among these research findings that you have shared with us. The pandemic exposed our knowledge, as the speakers have said, and try to pave our way forward. I thank to all the speakers, also those that have attended online. The debate has been streamed via YouTube and Facebook, notably on Polygon's social media, where it will remain online accessible. It is again one of the consequences of the pandemic. Events done online will remain online for those that have missed, but also allowing others to join from different parts of the world, and also remaining online also for research purposes. This is quite relevant and important. So thank you, and well, goodbye everybody.
Bye.